So this is the video for chapter 8, strings. We've already seen some introduction to strings when we were doing our files, some string manipulation methods. So this is a continuation to that lecture. And in this lecture, we're going to see how to do some validations, how to test strings, and so on and so forth. So let me just get started by sharing my screen. So today I want to show you something different that we haven't done before. So if you go to your REPL, log in as yourself, and this would be your home screen. So if you press home, this is how your home screen would look like. And here, instead of the tilde, if you put my handle, which is Suchi, wrote out one word, and then you can see my REPLs, all of my public REPLs that are needed for this class. And if you scroll down, I have broken down everything by chapters. And today we're going to see strings. So when you click on my REPL, we're still in my profile right now, and you can see an overview of how my REPL is. Maybe you can run it, but right now it's not going to do anything because I don't have any code written there. But what you can do is you can fork my REPL. Fork will essentially create a copy of my REPL inside your profile. So you can decide to change the name to make sense to you, say fall 2023 or spring 2023, whatever. Or if you want to still put your name, remove the chapter, whatever you want to do here, you can do. And then you can fork the REPL. When you do that, and then it'll open up the REPL here. And then we can go about the lecture here. But before I continue with the lecture, I'm going to go back to home. So if you were ever to stop this lecture and then want to continue it again another time, you can find it, going back to REPLs, you can click, and then you can see that's the one REPL I just created. So you can click on that REPL and you can resume your work. So in this chapter so far, about strings, we've seen what string is any data type, any kind of data that you enclose between single quotes or double quotes or triple single quotes or triple double quotes. According to Python, is a string. It really doesn't care what is inside the string. It only knows it as a string. And then when you try to use a print statement, it'll try to print it for you. So basic string operations that we have seen so far, not operations, but basic string functions we've used, print and input. So we know strings can be defined in these three different ways. Single quotes, you can use double quotes, and this is my favorite, the triple quotes, which here right now it prints, it has just a word, but triple quotes usually is used for paragraphic data. So you can take any paragraph and then put it in there, in whatever format it is in, it is going to print it just the way. So you can store an entire paragraph inside triple quotes like that, and then it will retain. And when you try to print this, it'll print it in that format. So inside this, you can have single quote, and you can even have double quotes, and it still won't break it. So that is what we've seen about strings in a very basic sense. Also, how to use the print statement. So print took as arguments sometimes one string, sometimes more than one, and it didn't even have to be a string. But right now, because it's string chapter, I will stay with strings only. So a string could take one string, print could take one string, two string, any number of strings, and it'll just display it for you in the console. So we've seen that. And because print is a void function, it didn't return anything, unlike input, which is a value returning function. So input would collect that in a variable on the left side, and then you have the input. And input really doesn't need any string, but we always do provide a string so that the user will know what to do. So if I don't give this, it's going to wait for the user's prompt, but the user is not going to know what it is. So we've seen print and input so far. So enter name is John, and this John is going to be stored in this variable called name, and we're not printing it anywhere, so nothing is going to happen. So that's pretty much a very basic introduction. We've seen that strings are immutable. That means once you create a string, you cannot modify it again. You can create a modified version of a string, but you cannot modify a string existing as it is existing. And strings are a type of sequence, just like lists and tuples were a sequence. Strings, according to Python, also is a sequence, as in each character of that string is considered as an element. So some of the operations that we have seen in lists and tuples also can be applied on a string. So let's see, let's dig deeper and see what we have. So we have seen the plus or the concatenation operator. So when we had two strings, and we wanted to put them together, and then store it in a new variable, and you can print that new variable, or you can omit the whole new variable and put this inside the print statement. It will simply mush these two up together, and then it'll print it for us. That was the concatenation operator. If you want to put a space between these two, you can add a third string, which is nothing but a space character, and put another concatenation operator. So basically, if you have three strings, you'll have two concatenation operators, and then when you run it, it's going to insert that space. So basically, we're concatenating three strings here. So repetition operator is technically, when you do it on numbers, it is a multiplication operator. But if you try to do that on a string, it's called a repetition operator, which repeats the string on the left side this many number of times. So the order is not important. It can still be 5 times string and it'll still do the same thing. So I have a string, TikTok, and I'm creating a new string, which is the original string repeated 5 times, and then I'm printing my new string. So that would give me TikTok, TikTok 5 times. So one thing to note here is this 5 is supposed to be an integer, so it cannot be a string, it cannot be a float. So 5.0, technically for human beings, it's 5, but Python considers that as a float. And when you try to multiply a float with a string, Python is not going to know what to do. And same thing with 5 as a string, that's not going to work either. So if you have something like that, you would have to convert it to an int. So if you have a float or a string, you would convert it into an integer for this operation to work. The best example is when you use an input statement and you ask the user, you tell me how many number of times you want to repeat the string. In that case, input will always return a string. So we would have to convert that into an integer for this to work. So when you do that, that's going to work. So there are some to remember from before, that every variable you concatenate must be a string. So when you use the concatenation operator, it's the same thing as it was here. You cannot concatenate a string and two numbers, or two strings and a number. That is not going to work. You would have to convert that into string using the str method, and then you can say run, and it will convert or it'll concatenate all three strings. So according to that, even though it's a 5, say same thing with a float, you would still have to concatenate it using by using the str method. So there you go, things to remember. Whenever you're using concatenation operator or a repetition operator, make sure the number is integer and the string is always going to be a string. So another thing to remember here using the repeat is that it has to be an integer. Floats and strings don't work. So I've kind of given these little tips and notes here for you to go back and revise. So the next thing we're going to see is string modification method. So strings are immutable. So we've seen that. So you're not actually modifying a string. You're actually creating a modified version of a string and saving it in another string. So that's what we're doing here. So we've seen this already when we were doing files. So I'm going to go really, really fast. So lower method converts something into a lowercase. So if you have a string like this, it will convert any uppercase character into lowercase, and then it'll ignore any numbers or special characters, and it'll print the lowercase converted string. So we're not actually modifying string, we're creating a modified copy of that and storing it in another variable, and then we're printing that. And if you know me, I like to consolidate my code and put everything in the same, instead of creating new variables, you can simply do that too, and that'll work too. So any uppercase characters here will be converted into lowercase. Lowercase are ignored, and numbers and special characters. So if I had a special character here, that will be ignored too. Python will not raise an exception as long as there's characters to convert. And again, even if you did not have a single alphabetical character in there, it will still not raise an exception. So that's lower. And conversely, we have upper. Upper converts everything to uppercase, regardless of numbers or special characters. We have seen the left strip method where it will remove any leading characters that you specify. If you don't specify anything, it'll remove any leading spaces. And R strip is anything that is trailing. So if you have any trailing characters, it'll remove those trailing characters. We've seen how to use that, but you're welcome to try them by yourself and see how they work. Also, please do remember to check out these methods. I'm not going to be able to explain every single method on strings for the scope of this class, but I do want you to be aware of these methods because we will be using one or more of these eventually. So this is where I'm going to start this chapter, is the indexing in string. So we've said string is a sequence just like a list or a tuple. So let's see how string also acts as a sequence. So just because we were able to access each element in a list using its index position, we can also access each character in a string based on the index position. And also remember, index is always start at 0. So here, if I have a string called the Hunger Games, and I'm trying to print the 5th character, the index position I should be using is 4 because index is started 0. So, and I try to print the 5th character, it'll print H, which is because it is counting space character also as a character. So all fine and dandy. The problem that's going to be here when you're using indexes, anytime you use indexes and square brackets to access any elements, the one problem or the one issue you need to be aware of, what if you use an index that doesn't exist? So this string is not 60 characters long, but I'm trying to access an element at the 60th position, and when I try to run that, Python is not going to like it, and it's going to tell me that the string is out of range. So you have to make sure whenever you're using indexing to be within the scope of the string's length. So that's one thing to remember. And there are some code snippets for you that I've given for you to try. So given this example, given this discussion, can you print the 7th character of the string above in uppercase? So not only do I need you to get me the 7th character, I also want you to convert it to upper, because we've seen how to convert a string into uppercase and then print it. So try it. If you cannot, if you don't know how to do it, then the answer is provided to you here. Go take a look at it. Next is len function. So if you want to know how many characters are there in a string, or for example, remember our example where we had the paragraph. Let's say I copy this paragraph and I have a string that has this much of data. And I just want to know how many characters are there. For whatever reason, I can simply use the len function. So the len function, it's not a method, it's a value returning function. So I have given you here a note that len always returns an integer. So when a function is returning something, we have to collect it in something. So I'm going to say number of characters. That's a typo, but that's okay. I'm going to use len. And then inside len, I'm going to pass data as an argument. And then I'm going to print the number of characters. And when I do that, it's going to tell me that it has 613 characters, including the spaces, periods, commas, single quotes. Everything is considered a character according to Python. So if you want to know the length of any string, for example, the given example here, all we do is we either calculate it and store it in a variable, or we can simply put it inside the print statement to consolidate the code, and it will print the number of characters in this string. So that's the length. Then we see in operator or not in operators. If you ever want to check for whether a string exists in a paragraph or in another bigger string, we use the in operator. So the typical syntax to use is to have a haystack. So think of this as my haystack. This is my big string, and I'm trying to find this needle where Watson is the needle that I'm looking for. Is it in the haystack? So very simply, is Watson in the string? So the if statement and using the in operator, I can see if a string is found inside a string or not. So there you go. Because Watson is in my string, it print found. But another thing to note is if I try a lowercase w, then Python is going to say not found, because the case compare, the search will always be case sensitive. So the logic is flipped if you use not in. So now if I try to if Watson not in string then print found, actually what it printed not found earlier, it will now print found because it's going to go into this code block just because we flipped the logic. Okay, so that's in and not in. I do have a code for you to try. So I've given you a big data paragraph here, and I'm asking you to see if you can find the word about. Okay, if you can find about in this, then print found, else print not found. So, and the one point to remember is it's going to be a case-sensitive search. All right, so next is string slicing. So we have seen list slicing when we were doing list chapter. What did it do? It kind of broke down a list into however we wanted it to. So start at the beginning and only give me the first character. We were able to specify a start and a stop. And in some cases, we also gave it a step to see skip the elements between and only get every third character or every fourth element or every fifth element. So just because string also acts like a list in the way that each character is like a list element, we can use the same concept of slicing on strings as well with the same exact syntax. So if I don't specify a start, Python is going to assume that it is 0. I can also specify a 0 if that makes sense. And then if I try to print the slice, what I'm trying to tell Python is start at the beginning and give me the 3 characters. And it'll try to print ULM. So if I say, well, I don't want every single character, I want you to give me every other character, then I'm going to specify 2. That means every second character in the same subset, then it's not going to print the L anymore, it's going to print UM. So I'm using a really small, teeny tiny string so I can illustrate it, but strings, you can use an entire paragraph and you can practice and see how you can slice the string. So anytime you use a string and slice it, it is always going to return a string. Just like in lists, anytime you did a slice on a list, it always returned a list. So here is a try this for you. I've given you a string in this code block and I want you to display a comma separated code. So try it and the answer is provided for you if you don't know how to do it. The next one is string testing methods. So one thing I want you to notice while I'm going through is each of these methods is starting with is. So it is basically trying to test if a string is conforming to whatever you want it to be. So for example, isAlnum is a method that is going to test if a string is all alphabetical and numerical. So for example, I have a string hello 1230. Just by looking at it, I can tell you there's only alphabets and numbers. Okay, so this test that I'm performing on the string, so string dot alnum. So this is the syntax to use these. These are all methods. So the string's name goes first, and then comes a dot, and then comes the name of this method. And these don't take any parameters. So if I try to print test, it is going to print it's true. It is true. The test is, it passed the test because it only has alphabets and numbers. It doesn't have any special characters. So the way for this test to fail is if I have at least one special character, then my test is going to fail and it's going to say false. So as you can tell, based on the print statement, the isAlnum will return a Boolean because the test is either true or false. So all of these methods, or most of these methods, will return Booleans only. So the best thing about a Boolean is you can use it inside an if statement. So instead of doing it like this, I can say if this is alphabetical or numbers, then print yes instead of true. Why can't I say yes? Okay, so if it's an alphanumeric string, print yes, otherwise print no. So right now I don't have an else block, but you're welcome to try it with the else block as well. So there you go, that's alnum. And isAlpha is a method that simply tries to see if a string has only alphabetical characters. So it will not allow, if you don't want to allow a string to have any other characters other than alphabets, then you want to use isAlpha. A good example would be name. When you're trying for a user's name and you want to make sure they're not entering numbers, it doesn't make any sense to have numbers or special characters in names. So that's when we try to do this test. And if I try to print this test, it is going to say, yes, this string has passed the test under isAlpha. The only problem is if I try to do James and space last name, this test is going to fail because, like it or not, space is a special character according to Python. So how will I handle that situation? So I do want to only have alphabetical characters, but I still need some spaces. So how can I allow that? We'll see that in the next section. Not now, but anytime you want to check for alphabetical only, then you would use that. So conversely, this is digit only tests only passes if a string is all numeric. So if you try to enter any non-numeric data in here, which is alphabets or special characters, this test is going to fail. So this is a good example to see if you want to allow say phone numbers. Okay, if you don't want to allow any hyphens or parentheses, you can make this test and say, just give me the 10 digits of the phone number, and you can try to use, hey, is everything a digit? If they give you any hyphens, or let's say if they give you this format, then the test is going to fail because it's not all digits. It's got special characters, parentheses and hyphens and spaces are all special characters. So that's another method. And isLower, as the name suggests, it'll check to see if every character in the string is lower or not. So say, for example, hello 1 2 3 and 12 and asterisk for whatever reason, if I want to test that if it is lower, then I would use the isLower method. And if I try to print this test, it is going to be true because I do have some characters in there, but every single one of them is lowercase. So the test is true, and the only way the test will fail is if you had at least one uppercase. Everything else the same. If you had one uppercase, it'll be false. So conversely, we have is upper. It's the opposite. So the only way this will be true is every single character that you have in your string needs to be an uppercase, and then that's the only instance, and it doesn't care whether it's numbers and special characters. It'll be okay as long as all the alphabetical characters are in uppercase. So to make this test fail, I'm just going to put one lowercase and the test is going to fail. So that is upper. So I'm going to go through eSpace. eSpace is if you want to check if a string has only spaces. It has no other data, but it has one space or more than one space. That's when we're going to use eSpace. So in this instance, because my string has nothing but white space, my test is going to pass. And it's going to say, yep, everything is a space. The only way for it to fail is just introduce any character between there, and the test is going to fail and print false. So these are all testing methods. So I want you to know that each of them, note that all of these start with is, and also remember that every single return type is a Boolean here. So that's why we're printing true and false. So next is searching and replacing. So we have seen in Word documents in Excel, we have a Control F and Control R to find something, and you want to replace it with something else. So this is very similar to that. In addition to the search and replace, we have two methods. One of them is ends with, and the other one is starts with. So it's very simply, as the name suggests, you want to test a string. So you have a string, and in that string, you want to test, hey, is my string ending with two zeros. How would you test that? Then you would use ends with as a substring here. So instead of creating a separate variable, I can simply put 0, 0. Instead of even string, I'm simply going to put my entire string inside this. So that's another way. You really don't have to create additional variables. So my test is testing to see if this string, which is my haystack, is ending with this needle or not. And if yes, then it's going to print true. So in this case, it does end with 0, 0. How about 2, 0, 0? Yes, it ends with 2, 0, 0. So as long it doesn't really care however length you give, as long as it's a subset of the string, it is going to pass. But the only time it's going to fail is if it doesn't end with. So for example, instead of 100, 0, 0, if I say ends with 0, 1, then the test is going to be false. So same thing with starts with, is it's going to do the opposite. Is that substring starting occurring at the beginning of the string. So is my string starting with 400? Yes, that is true. And Python is going to print true. If I try to print the search test. Okay. So if I try to change that, instead of 400, if I said 40, will that be true or false? Yes, it will still be true because it is starting with 40. The only way to fail it is if I test 401, because every single character in the substring has to match with the first 3 characters or first n number of characters that I specify. If it doesn't, then it's going to be false. So then the next one is the find method. So as the name suggests, find tries to find something in a string. So this is a true needle in a haystack situation. So if 8 is in this string, then the search test will be true. If it's not, then it's going to be false. So let's go and see. So obviously, just by reading at it, 8 is not in this. So I should get a false, which it didn't, instead of false. So I want you to note that find is a method that will always return integer. So don't, there's a to remember here for future, that find will always return an integer, ends with and start with return a boolean, just like all our is methods. Ends with and start with also return true, but find will return an integer. So what does -1 mean? -1 means that it did not find the string. But what if it did find the string? So if I give it 4 and say, hey, can you find 4 in the string? Is it going to print true or false? So let's see. So it printed a 0, which is the first occurrence of 4. 4 occurred at the first position in my string. So instead of 4, if I said 3, then it's going to look for where is 4 in the string, and the occurrence position is not 0 anymore. It's going to print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's going to print me the first occurrence of the index position of that character. So if I try to print 5, then it is going to give me the index position for 5, which happens to be 6. So to remember, find will always return an integer, and if it is returning a -1, that means it did not find the character that it's looking for in the string. The last method here is going to replace. So yes, in a lot of cases, we have to replace some strings with another string. So for example, if I have a small string, UNIF of Louisiana Monroe, and if I want to change UNIF to the abbreviation to the full expanded string, then I can use replace method like this. And the returned value is not a Boolean, it is going to be a string. So there we go. So it replaced my character, my substring with the new string that I specified. And the syntax, again, you know me, you can simply put everything in here. So the replacement will go here. The original needle will go here. And the haystack, which is the big long string, the original string, will go here. There we go. So Now let me come back to our original problem that we faced earlier. We wanted to see if a name, James Ellis, is a valid name or not, right? So now if I just do an alpha test on it, so if I simply do name dot alpha is alpha, then it is going to print false because it has a space character. So there you go, it printed false. So how can I allow Python to have a space character, but still check for only alphabetical characters? That's when I would use a replace. Right before I do the test, I'm going to say replace any space characters and replace them with nothing. So let's do it one at a time first and break it down, and then we'll see what's going to happen. So new name is equal to name dot replace, and then any string, any space characters that you see, just replace them with nothing, as in we're trying to remove the space character. So if I try to print new name now, what is it going to display? Or I'm just gonna all I'm doing is stripping the spaces. So now there you go. It removed any spaces, any number of spaces that you will have. James Ellis the second. It'll remove every single space, and then all I have is alphabetical. So now if I test, is alpha on this string, then it is going to print me yes. So that's one additional step I would have to add. So one thing I can do is I can do everything inside one, and then if I try to print the new name, it's going to print the one. It's going to print true because even though it has spaces, it is still a valid name. So instead of new name, if I simply put if name, when you replace the spaces with empty spaces, and check if it is alphabetical, and if it passes that test, if means if it passes the test, then say print valid name. Else print invalid name. So can we do that kind of testing? Because remember when I said that alpha is a boolean that you can operate on a string. So this whole thing is a string because replace returns a string. So as long as you keep the order in the same way, you cannot use is alpha first, and then if you do it like this, so if you try to test name on is alpha, you can do that, but it's going to return a boolean, and you cannot do a replace operation on a boolean, and it's going to give an error. So order is also important. More important is to understand what data types are each method returning. So now if I flip them and I try to see, okay, so James Ellis 3 is a valid name despite the spaces. So that's how we can use different methods together to give us some sort of validation on strings. So the next thing is looping over a string. So just like a list, which is a collection of elements, string is a collection of characters. So if you can use a for loop to loop through each character. So if I try using a for loop and use ch as my for loop variable instead of ch, let me do char. That makes a little bit more sense. So for each character in this string, that's what Python reads it as, that as long as there are characters in this string, keep doing whatever is specified in the for loop block. And what is specified here? We're just asking it to print that character. So it is going to print each character at a time. So before I can do that, I'm going to do why I did that? I'm just going to make my code slow down. So I'm using a time module to slow down the code execution so we can actually see what is going on here. So the first time the loop executes, it'll print 1, and then it'll go test that string again to see, are there any more characters? Yes. Then it prints the next character and the next character and the next character. And then when it's done and it can't find any more, it's going to end the execution. So that is how a for loop works on a string, one character at a time. So I have given a closer look. If it doesn't make sense, I want you to go towards the closer look and see if that makes sense. And last thing is string splitting. So we have already seen this in files. We've taken a comma separated string and we tried to break it down into list elements. So if you just have a string, it's really very hard to modify a string in Python, or for that matter in any programming language. It's really difficult to manipulate a string for it to do what we want it to do. So that's why we kind of break it down into tokens or list elements, if you will. So if you have a string like this and you want to create each of these words into a list element, then you can use the string split method. So this is the name of the string that I just created here, and then on that string I'm going to perform the split method, and if split will always return a list. So if I try to print that list, it's going to break it down. Each of these words are now broken down into one list element. And I can do the same thing if I have a delimiter. If I didn't have a space, but I had a delimiter instead, that means each of my elements are separated by a comma, as I say. And if I want to separate everything by a comma, then I can use comma as a delimiter. So split should have comma inside it enclosed in single quotes or double quotes, and then tell Python, hey, split this string anywhere you see a comma, split it into a new element and add it to this list. So when I run that, it's going to show me that each of those elements now is a list element. So that is about everything I wanted to cover in strings chapter. So I do have some things that you need to remember, which split method will always return a list. And then there's a couple of code examples I've given you here to see how you can work with this and see how you can use split method. And if you don't know the answer, I have provided you the answer. Try it without peeking. So that's all for this lecture.